Joy to the world. The Lord has come to bring peace on earth and goodwill to all people, to bring salvation to all who call on His name, to create in us a clean slate, to extend His grace and love to all. Don't you just love celebrating Christmas? Jesus has come. We've celebrated the hope, the peace, the joy, the love that we've all been anticipating in Advent. But now what? What do we do now that Jesus has come and we have celebrated His coming? Is it enough to simply celebrate? To bask in the glory of the Lord? There's definitely merit in doing so, but isn't there more to living the Christian life than that? Surely there's some sort of expectation to following Christ. I haven't seen one in a while, but when I was a kid, I remember walking up to some convenience stores and seeing a sign on the door. And it said, no shirt, no shoes, no service. And those signs always intrigued me because it never said anything about pants. I always wanted to test that theory, but I never got the courage to do so. But other than no pants, the message was clear. Clothing was not optional. This is what Paul is getting at with the Colossians. He's reminding them that once you've chosen to follow this resurrected Christ, it's time to change clothes. Time to be transformed and begin a new way of living and viewing the world. It's time to quit living in sin and quit living our selfish lives. Just earlier in chapter 3, Paul writes this: "Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthy, fornication, impurity, evil desire, and greed. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of your Creator." Paul's using some intense imagery right here. Put to death. Strip off. Paul isn't playing around. He understands the dangers of living in sin, so he wants to be very clear. Don't even mess around with that stuff. That way of living is harmful not only to you, but it's harmful to everyone around you. It's not enough to just set it aside. Kill that stuff. It makes me think of the wood floors in my house on Resident Row, all the wood floors actually in all the houses. Before we moved in a year and a half ago, several of y'all came into those houses and redid them, including the floors. You didn't just come in and stain over the old nasty stain that was already there. But you came in and you sanded those floors. You put in the effort to get it down to its bare wood so that when you re-stained it, it looked new. It looked beautiful, almost unrecognizable. It would have been a lot easier to just cover up the old, but in order to get the best result, it was best to strip it down and start over. Putting away our old way of living and old way of thinking, although extremely beneficial, can be extremely difficult and extremely painful. Sometimes we even want to go back to the old way of living and think that would be better because it was easy. It was comfortable. Remember the Hebrews? When they were in the wilderness, they kept griping and complaining at Moses for bringing them out of slavery. They wanted to go back because at least they got 3 meals a day. At least they knew what to expect. They couldn't see in their transition the future of the promised land. According to James Blanco and Ralph Stayer, change is hard because people overestimate the value of what they have and underestimate the value of what they may gain by giving it up. Even when we've been transformed by the love of Christ, change is difficult because we can't see the future tangible benefit of what that looks like. So Paul is giving us some direction in what that should look like. Not only what to take off, but what to put on. When we've encountered Christ, we are to clothe ourselves with compassion, with kindness, with humility, patience. We bear with one another. We forgive one another. And then finally, we put on love, the power that holds all things together in perfect harmony. This new clothing isn't optional. Paul doesn't say if you'd like to or if it's convenient. It's the way you follow Christ. It's what you do when you surrender your life to Him. But undressing is not enough. We've got to redress ourselves. It's important to clothe ourselves or we'll leave ourselves exposed. When we take off dirty clothes, we don't just run around naked, at least some of us. We don't want to leave ourselves vulnerable and exposed, but we want to protect our bodies. We want to make sure that we protect other people as well from our bodies. In our most basic, stripped down self, these virtues are not our go-to. It's not our natural way of being. So if all we do is take off the old and don't put anything else on, we're in trouble. Because the old is just going to keep creeping back and creeping back and creeping back. And before we know it, we've stepped right back into that old self. Paul is telling us the proper clothes we need to be wearing as Christians so we don't live our lives dressed inappropriately. Now, I don't know about you, but there's been several occasions that I've walked into where I wasn't dressed appropriately. That's an awkward feeling. You feel out of place and just kind of want to go leave. You kind of just want to get out of there and leave because you're just kind of ashamed with how you look in some way. But the virtues that Paul recommends ensures that we will never be dressed inappropriately. If compassion and kindness, humility and love are the way that we're dressed appropriately for any occasion. Because of Christ, we have a clean slate. We've been forgiven, and now we're expected to forgive as we've been forgiven. We're expected to show compassion as we've been shown compassion. We're expected to be kind as we've been shown kindness, and we're expected to be patient as we've been shown patience. It only makes sense that since we are followers of Christ, we begin to clothe ourselves with the characteristics of Christ. And unfortunately, this doesn't happen automatically, but requires effort and action on our part. We have to begin to take steps towards changing. It's not going to happen overnight, but over a lifetime. If we aren't careful, we can become frustrated with ourselves and be discouraged and too hard on ourselves and with other people when progress doesn't seem to be happening as quickly as we want it to. We want to be now where we are going to be later. And a lot of times that's a hard place to be, because if we live our lives that way, we're never going to be good enough in our own eyes. It's like wanting to go and buy sweaters of compassion and kindness, and then realizing that we have to knit them ourselves. It takes time. It takes effort. Putting on these virtues is like buying clothes for a child. You don't ever worry about buying clothes too big for a child most of the time, because they're going to grow into them. If you buy something too big, sooner or later, they'll fit. Same thing with us. These are lofty goals for us to live up to. But if we continue living with Christ, we'll eventually grow into these virtues. Paul is so adamant about these things because they are basic necessities to any relationship. Without compassion, we have no concern for the other. Without kindness, we do whatever it takes to get our way. Without humility, we end up alone, because our pride puts us against one another rather than drawing us toward one another. Without patience, we become unnecessarily frustrated, which is taken out on other people, causing us to say things we wish we wouldn't have. These characteristics are what allow us to bear with one another when we disagree, and to forgive each other when we hurt. Compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, and forgiveness are all extremely important, but none of them are as important as love, which holds all things together. As many of you know, because George announced it several weeks ago, I'm newly engaged. Now, many of you have forgotten more about marriage than I could stand up here and talk to you about, so I'm not going to do that. But even though I'm not married just yet and I'm only a month into being engaged, I've already experienced the necessity of Paul's list. For 30 years, each of us has been able to do whatever we wanted to do, whenever we wanted to do it, with whom we wanted to do it. Now we not only have to consider what each other want, but we have to consider what other people want in this new family that we are adopting. In a few months, we're going to be putting on rings. And when we do, we'll be putting on this symbolism of humility, kindness, love, forgiveness. Even when we fail each other, the rings remind us of the decision we've made, our commitment to each other, to choose kindness over being right, humility over being in charge, forgiveness over holding grudges, and most of all, love, which holds all things together. When you put on clothing that Paul's referred to, you are making the same kinds of commitments to one another and to people outside of these walls. Today, many people not too far outside of these walls are hurting due to the tragic storms that passed through last night, dealing with loss of life, loss of property, loss of material possessions. For some of them, the choice of what clothing they'll be wearing isn't optional. They're left with the clothes on their backs. For them, it's not a spiritual or metaphorical issue, it's a tangible loss. So the question for us is, how will we respond? How will we dress in this occasion? What better way to show we are dressed in compassion and love than to give physical clothes to those who are in need? to go and to be a presence in their lives, to encourage and support them in this difficult time. When we clothe ourselves with love, we're able to show compassion and humility even when it's difficult, when it's scary, or even when we don't know anybody. Because love always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. Love never fails. So even when we do fail one another, love runs deeper than failure. It goes beyond disappointment and hurt, not to the point where we excuse it or deny it, but to the point where we together can overcome it. The difficult thing about love, though, is there's some people that are hard to love. Anybody else have that problem? It may be a group of people. Oftentimes it's my own family. But even more so, surprisingly enough, the person that I find difficult to love most often is myself. And I think a lot of us in here may resonate with that. We get caught in the comparison game, begin thinking we're not good enough, or if only I had done this differently, if only I had that skill or that ability, if only I had those parents, if only I had that child, if only I had this job, if only I had this much money. It's difficult to love ourselves because we know ourselves better than we know anybody else. With this new year approaching, our insecurities are often magnified. We begin thinking about ways that we can become the person we want to become. Many of us, if not all of us, will be thinking about and making New Year's resolutions. I want to lose weight. I want to manage my money more effectively. I'm going to do less laundry and instead wear more deodorant. Katie's got a lot of work to do. The fact that resolutions are made every year when failure is most certain shows there is a desire for change, and that desire for change comes from a desire to love ourselves. Now, this may sound selfish, but it's important to love ourselves. Jesus, in fact, does say, love your neighbor as yourself. So if we aren't loving ourselves well, it's going to be difficult to love others well. There's an old song, it says, fill my cup and let it overflow. Fill my cup and let it overflow. Fill my cup and let it overflow. Let it overflow with love. And I love that song because it is the gospel in however long that was. We get filled up with God's love. And then we're called to clothe ourselves with love so that love overflows to everyone around us. That's the reason that clothing isn't optional. When we clothe ourselves with compassion, humility, kindness, love, people are going to see that God loves them. People are going to know that their current situation is not the way it has to be, but they can know a God who can set them free, who can give them peace and love, give them hope. A great example of this overflowing love happened a few weeks ago on Baylor's campus. In the wake of all the terrorist attacks and the anti-Muslim rhetoric, a member of the media went to the campus chaplain and said, how are all the Muslim students responding? How are they handling all this stuff, all this pressure? Berlin said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And so in response to that question, he decided to hold a prayer service, a gathering for all the Muslim students, and have all those who were victims of injustice and acts of terrorism join as well. More than 400 Baylor students showed up, faculty, staff, and a few Waco residents as well. Burleson said, "We are going to gather so our Muslim friends can see the love and support they have at Baylor." Several signs that were at the prayer service said, "We are all children of God, and we stand with you." It would have been easy to sit by, do nothing, but when we've experienced this transforming power and the love of Christ, we can't do nothing. As you think about what your New Year's resolution might be, may it go a little bit deeper than weight loss and bank accounts. I challenge you to think of one new way which you can serve the kingdom of God. In this new year, how will you intentionally dress in the clothes of compassion, kindness, humility, forgiveness, and most of all, love? Amen.